This week, the Bible in 40 words, we look at the word exile, and we're reading the book of Daniel. I've encouraged you throughout this journey to look at different translations of the Bible, especially when you get stuck, because sometimes reading from a different translation can open up new insights. So today I'm going to read to you from a different translation, Baby's First Bible, the story of Daniel. It's one sentence long. Daniel prayed to God and not to men, and God kept Daniel safe in the lion's den. Why are we reading from Baby's First Bible? Well, I wanted to do that because I wanted to point out the fact that if you're going to condense the Bible down to maybe just a dozen stories, the story of Daniel makes the cut. And that's because it's a story that gives great encouragement, an action-packed story, a really interesting story, as it has always been. The story of Daniel takes place when Daniel is in exile. He's living in Babylon, far from his homeland, and he's living among people who are hostile to his way of faith, to his way of worshiping God in the world. And so anytime people have felt like the world around them is hostile to them and their way of worship, they've turned to Daniel. So Daniel takes place in the time of exile, but it was actually written much later. It was written toward the end of the Old Testament period, probably in the 2nd century before Christ. And we know that it was written in such a late period because several chapters of it are written in Aramaic. And Aramaic is a derivative of the Hebrew language that evolved later. It was the language that Jesus spoke. And so in the original, they went back and forth between Hebrew and Aramaic in this book. We wouldn't know that if we're just reading it in English. But it reminds us that the people who actually wrote it down and put it on paper were retelling an old story from their past as a way of saying, don't forget. Now that we are going through a persecution and a hard time, we've been here before. We've done this before. We've lived as exiles before. And so it was written for every person who has felt like an exile, every person who has felt like their values aren't valued by the world around them. So it's a good book to read. If you're following along, we've made it through the major prophets, the big ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And after Daniel, we'll turn to the minor prophets, very, very short books. And it can get a little confusing to follow the timeline because we're actually going back again over and over and over the same territory of people in exile. And so, people in exile, if you are feeling a little alone in your faith, a little weary in the middle of this long, hot summer, may you find joy in the book of Daniel. Amen.